The Night of the Generals was not just Anatole Litvack's most expensive failure, it was a $10 million murder mystery assembled by a producer who had been driven out of Germany by the Nazis and who spent the rest of his life making films about what Germany had produced, built around two stars who were paid less than a supporting player because they had signed contracts before they became famous. Written by Gore Vidal, among others, without anyone crediting him, filmed in Warsaw behind the Iron Curtain, in a rarity for Western productions, and delivered at a loss of at least $3 million, while containing what one film critic later placed alongside Travis Bickle as one of the greatest character studies in cinema history. We are digging into the wreckage of the Night of the Generals with 13 dark secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside Sam Spiegel's biography, production correspondence, the novel's own moral architecture, and the kind of salary records that only become fully revealing once you understand what the studio thought the two stars of Lawrence of Arabia were worth the year before they became the two stars of Lawrence of Arabia. The title, The Night of the Generals, announces a single night of criminal violence, the darkness in which power acts without accountability. What Kirst's novel had understood, and what the film translated with considerable fidelity into its dialogue, was that this was not actually about a night. It was about the permanent condition of generalship, the institutional reality that men who command mass killing are not merely permitted, but encouraged to develop a relationship to human life that, in a different context, would be diagnosed as pathological. The film's single most precise line belongs to Omar Sharif's Major Gogh: "Murder is the occupation of generals." What the title gives away, a single night, an isolated event, the line takes back. This is not deviance, it is profession. Tanz is not a general who has become a murderer. He is a murderer who has been given a general's authority and resources. And what the institutional machinery of the Wehrmacht has done is make that combination not merely possible, but celebrated. The title is the polite version. The line is the honest one. Sam Spiegel arrived at the Night of the Generals in the shadow of the most commercially catastrophic judgment call of his producing career. The Chase in 1966, starring Marlon Brando, had received a universal thumbs down and convinced Spiegel that he had not exercised sufficient creative control over that production. His response was to determine that on his next project, he would monitor every creative decision more closely. What this resolution produced, in practice, was a production environment so saturated with producer interference that O'Toole subsequently accused Spiegel of demanding rewrites on a near-daily basis, an accusation that, if accurate, explains the film's structural incoherence more precisely than any directorial failure. But the deeper biographical fact about Spiegel and the Night of the Generals is the one that runs underneath every production decision he made. Spiegel had himself been driven out of Germany by the Nazi regime in the 1930s, had worked in various European countries under assumed names, and had spent his Hollywood career making films whose moral arguments were, in one way or another, about the consequences of institutional power applied without restraint. The African Queen, On the Waterfront, The Bridge on the River Kwai, Lawrence of Arabia. These are not films made by a man with no ideological position. They are films made by a man who understood what it meant to be destroyed by institutional power, and who spent his career documenting that destruction in the language of entertainment. The Night of the Generals was his most direct statement of that subject. A film about generals whose institutional authority protected their murders. The man who had fled those generals was the man who produced the film about what they were. The screenplay of The Night of the Generals carries a credit that is a small masterpiece of institutional complexity, based on the novel by Hans Kirst and based on an incident written by James Chase. The first credit references Kirst's 1962 Die Nacht der Generale. The second references Chase's 1952 novel The Wary Transgressor, specifically a subplot involving a corporal who is falsely implicated in a murder which Kessel and Den grafted onto Kirst's investigation narrative to provide the human romantic interest the film required commercially. What neither credit acknowledges is the presence of a third writer, Gore Vidal, who worked on the screenplay and was not credited on screen. Vidal later claimed he had urged Spiegel to hire a new hot director, specifically arguing against Litvack's appointment. He was overruled on both counts. Litvack was hired because he owned the rights to the novel, and Vidal's script work went uncredited. The resulting screenplay was thus the product of, at minimum, 4 creative intelligences: Kirst, Chase, Kessel, and Den, and Vidal, reconciled by a fifth, Litvack, whose creative authority was simultaneously undermined by Spiegel's daily interference. That the finished film is as coherent as it is represents, under those conditions, a production miracle. David Lean was Sam Spiegel's first and preferred choice to direct The Night of the Generals, a choice whose logic was almost parodically transparent. Spiegel had produced Lawrence of Arabia. Lean had directed it. The two principal stars were the same, and the institutional instinct was to replicate the formula. Lean was unavailable. Spiegel then turned to Litvak, the experienced crime and thriller director who had made The Snake Pit and Sorry, Wrong Number, and who possessed the rights to the source novel, making his exclusion practically impossible, regardless of Spiegel's preference. Gore Vidal, who had lobbied for a new, hot director, unnamed in the public record but clearly representative of the new Hollywood energy that was already beginning to reshape the industry, was overruled. What the film that resulted reflects is not Lean's architectural precision and not the new Hollywood's disruptive intelligence, but Litvak's old-school professionalism operating under the simultaneous pressure of Spiegel's interference and the narrative demands of three incompatible source materials. The film that Lean might have made with its two principles, its morally complex investigation, its European settings, is one of the great uncompleted hypotheticals in 1960s cinema. The salary structure of The Night of the Generals is the production's most precisely documented injustice, and the one that most accurately explains the attitude both leads brought to the work. O'Toole and Sharif had been signed to contracts with Spiegel before Lawrence of Arabia was released, contracts whose terms reflected their pre-stardom market value. When Lawrence made them two of the most recognizable faces on the planet and the most commercially desirable leads in the business, those contracts remained legally binding. By 1966, when production began, O'Toole's and Sharif's combined salaries for The Night of the Generals were reportedly less than the fee paid to Donald Pleasence, a respected and accomplished character actor who had not remotely approached their level of commercial drawing power. Pleasence himself was apparently unaware of this disparity until later. O'Toole and Sharif were made aware of it. Their response was documented in Internet Movie Database records. They took care to claim the lavish living expenses to which their contracts entitled them, using the expense account as the mechanism by which they extracted from the production, the compensation, their salaries denied them. Gore Vidal's subsequent suggestion that O'Toole may have deliberately underperformed as a form of contractual revenge for his low pay adds a further dimension to the performance debates the film has always generated. The decision to film the Warsaw sequences of The Night of the Generals on location in Warsaw itself, behind the Iron Curtain, in communist Poland, for a Western-financed production, was a logistical achievement of sufficient rarity that the New York Times published an article about it in May 1966. Poland's communist government, which was simultaneously Soviet-aligned and deeply invested in documenting the Nazi occupation's devastation of Warsaw, had an institutional interest in cooperating with a production that depicted German generals committing atrocities in its capital city. The negotiations that produced this cooperation involved diplomatic channels, production guarantees, and the specific political calculation that a Hollywood film showing Polish suffering under German occupation served both the Polish government's narrative needs and the production's authenticity requirements. What the location gave the film that no backlot equivalent could have provided was the specific texture of a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt. The streets, the architecture, the faces of people who lived in a place that still carried the physical memory of what had happened in it. The Warsaw sequences have a weight that the Paris sequences entirely lack, and the weight is not cinematic craft. It is geography. The buildings remember what happened to them. The sequence in which General Tanz gains private access to the Jeu de Paume Gallery's locked storage of Entartet Kunst, the art the Nazi regime had confiscated from Jewish collections and labeled degenerate and stands in front of Van Gogh's self-portrait painted in the asylum at St. Remy, is the film's most discussed and most precisely argued scene. The paintings stored in that room are documented historical fact. The Jeu de Paume had served as the collection and sorting facility for art looted from Jewish families across occupied France, from which Goering selected what he wanted for his own collection, and the remainder was either sold, destroyed, or eventually repatriated. Tanz's access to art his regime has labeled pathological, art produced by madness, by the kind of mind the regime systematically exterminated, and his visible psychological crisis in front of it functions as the film's most complete statement of its own argument. The man who commands mass murder is standing before the portrait of a man who only hurt himself, and the portrait is the mirror he cannot bear to look into. O'Toole described Tanz's schizophrenia as revealed only in occasional hints, the mask and the true face device. In the Van Gogh scene, the mask falls completely. The face underneath it is looking at itself. Hans Kirst, born in East Prussia in 1914, a member of the Nazi Party from youth, a Wehrmacht officer from 1933 to 1945, a first lieutenant and Nazi political officer who said afterward that he had confused National Socialism with Germany, did not claim, when the novel was published in 1962, to be writing from a position of external judgment. He was writing from the inside of the institution he was indicting. His Tanz is not a monster inserted into an otherwise honorable military culture. He is the military culture's logic pursued to its endpoint, the man for whom all human life has become subordinate to institutional function, and for whom the institutional function, military victory, has itself become subordinate to the psychological need to dominate and destroy. Kirst had served under men like Tanz. He had received orders from men like Tanz. He had executed those orders. His novel is not a condemnation of an aberration. It is a confession about a system, about what the system he had served produced when it generated a Tanz and then gave him tanks. The novel's Edgar Award nomination in 1965 recognized a thriller. What it had actually nominated was an act of public self-examination by a former Nazi officer who had decided that the only honest response to his own history was to put it on the page and let readers decide what it meant. The Night of the Generals belongs to a specific tradition of post-war European crime films that use the Nazi period as a moral laboratory, a space in which the logic of institutional violence could be examined without the political deflections available in contemporary settings. The most direct ancestor is not Kirst's novel, but Carol Reed's The Third Man from 1949, whose Vienna is the same kind of morally compromised post-war landscape, whose investigation is conducted by a man who discovers that the institution he trusted has been using institutional authority to conceal individual depravity, and whose ending refuses to provide the comfortable resolution that genre conventions expect. What Spiegel and Litvak produced was a third man at general officer rank, the same investigation, the same institutional protection of the guilty, the same belated and incomplete justice, but set inside the German military rather than inside the Allied occupation bureaucracy. The connection between the two films is structural and thematic, and the fact that Spiegel had not produced The Third Man while Korda had does not diminish the lineage. It merely explains why Spiegel spent 3 years trying to find a way to make it his. Donald Pleasence's compensation for his role as General Kallenberg, the conspirator general, the man whose involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler makes him simultaneously the most morally complex figure in the film and the least dramatically interesting, was, by documented accounts, 2 to 4 times what O'Toole and Sharif received combined. The disparity was an artifact of when each actor's contract had been signed. Pleasence, negotiating in 1965 rather than in pre-Lawrence 1961, commanded his current market rate. What Pleasence delivered for his superior compensation was a performance of accomplished craft, the general with a conscience, as one reviewer called him, the man who makes the moral argument the film needs made without ever quite making it land with the force it deserves. Pleasence understood precisely what he was doing. His own comment about the film, that he was very aware he was acting in pure junk, is the most devastatingly precise assessment of the production made by anyone involved in it, delivered with the particular authority of a man who had been paid well enough to be honest about what he had made. By 1972, The Night of the Generals had lost at least $3 million. The production that Spiegel had conceived as the successor to Lawrence of Arabia, 2 of the same stars, the same producer, a European epic about institutional power and individual dignity, had performed at the box office with sufficient disappointment that its losses were still being calculated 5 years after its release. The film's place in Spiegel's biographical trajectory tells the story with precision. The Chase had failed in 1966. The Night of the Generals failed in 1967. The Happening, a third consecutive failure, also appeared in 1967. The producer who had delivered The African Queen, On the Waterfront, The Bridge on the River Kwai, and Lawrence of Arabia had entered a commercial losing streak of sufficient severity to suggest that whatever instinct had made those films possible had not survived Lawrence's success. His subsequent productions, Nicholas and Alexandra, The Last Tycoon, continued the pattern. The producer who had driven out of Germany with nothing and built the most impressive string of Best Picture-nominated films in mid-century Hollywood had crested with Lawrence, and the films that followed never recovered altitude. The Night of the Generals is the most interesting of those failures, the one that most directly engaged the subject matter of Spiegel's own biography and most completely failed to convert that engagement into commercial result. The critical reception of The Night of the Generals at its January 1967 release was the specific kind of disappointed generosity that studios dread. critics who found the film interesting enough to engage with and insufficient enough to endorse. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times described it as a lurid and mordant screen account delivered with some interest and some tedium, a verdict whose precision identifies exactly where the film fails, without denying that it also succeeds. Philip Shore in the Los Angeles Times called it a searchlight on a madness, locating the film's genuine achievement in O'Toole's performance while noting the narrative's structural incoherence. Newsweek offered the line that has best survived. O'Toole's General Tan's looks, with his remarkable facial tics, like a time bomb preparing to go off. The critical consensus treated the film as a compromised ambition, a production that had aimed at Lawrence of Arabia and arrived somewhere considerably less coherent. What they were measuring was the gap between the film's parts and its whole. None adequately addressed the fact that the parts, O'Toole's performance, the Warsaw location work, the film's central moral argument, were more sustained and more significant than a film that lost $3 million was entitled to produce. The 6 decades since the film's commercial and critical disappointment have produced something that disappointed films occasionally generate, a reassessment whose specificity exceeds the original assessments. The frame-rated review that placed O'Toole's Tans alongside De Niro's Travis Bickle as one of the greatest character studies in cinema history was not hyperbole. It was the application of a critical vocabulary that 1967 had not yet developed. The vocabulary of the character study as a genre in itself, in which the psychological architecture of a single figure is examined with sufficient precision to constitute an argument about human nature, rather than merely a narrative device. Tans is not a villain. He is a diagnosis. He is the institutional military culture's internal logic made flesh, the man who emerges when you take the values of command hierarchy, the subordination of individual conscience to organizational purpose, and the dissociation of action from consequence, and apply them consistently to a single human being over the course of an entire military career. The film understood this in 1967. It required the subsequent decades' worth of scholarship on authoritarian psychology, institutional violence, and the banality of evil to develop the language to say so clearly. The film that survived, built on 3 incompatible source texts, directed by a man who owned the novel's rights rather than the producer's confidence, starring 2 actors paid less than the supporting cast, filmed behind the Iron Curtain, losing $3 million while containing one of the great performances of the decade, is the most precisely personal film Sam Spiegel ever produced, and the one least examined in those terms. The man who had been expelled from Germany by the regime depicted in the film made a film about what that regime protected and produced. O'Toole played the product with facial tics and gloves and a private madness that the institutional machinery had never needed to contain, because the institutional machinery had always channeled it toward approved targets. Sharif played the investigator who spent 20 years pursuing justice that the same institutional machinery had never intended to deliver. Pleasence played the man who understood what the institution was and participated in it anyway. And Kirst, the former Wehrmacht officer, the former Nazi Party member, the man who had confused National Socialism with Germany, wrote the source material as an act of confession that the film turned into an entertainment and the critics turned into a disappointment and the decades turned into an argument that is still being made. But here is the question that The Night of the Generals leaves embedded in that Warsaw courtyard, in those red trouser stripes that a witness glimpsed in a stairwell, and a general's rank that protected the man above them for 20 years. If the most precise fictional examination of how institutional military authority protects individual pathology, written by a man who had served that authority, produced by a man who had fled it, starring actors who were being paid less than their supporting cast because contracts signed before they were famous, could not be renegotiated, lost $3 million, and was dismissed as a compromised ambition, then what does that tell you about which arguments a commercial culture will pay to have confirmed and which ones it will pay to avoid? And if the answer is that the arguments about institutional protection of powerful men's crimes are exactly the ones the market consistently refuses to reward, which films being made right now about that subject are going to lose $3 million while containing the most important scene of the decade? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see The Night of the Generals, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.